Welcome to the Book Voices channel. If you enjoy our content, don't forget to like and subscribe to stay updated with our latest book discussions. Now let's dive into today's book.
Okay, so going back and like looking at all the stuff you sent over for this deep dive, really, it kind of triggered this like super vivid memory for me. A couple years ago, I had this, I guess you could say, pretty serious injury.
Hmm.
I had a bad fall, actually. Broke my nose, got some facial fractures, the whole thing really. I mean, even my vision was messed up for a while. It was rough.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And for months, it felt like everything just totally stopped. Like I couldn't do anything. I mean, even simple stuff like walking in a straight line, it was a challenge. And the whole recovery process was just this long, gradual thing. It was a lot of physical therapy and honestly just trying to get back to feeling somewhat normal again.
I can imagine.
Yeah. But what I really remember, and it's kind of stuck with me ever since, is that there wasn't like this one big moment where it was like, boom, I'm all better. It was this continuous series of these little tiny breakthroughs, like just these small wins along the way. And that feeling, that sense of like slow but steady progress is really what we're going to unpack today in this deep dive.
What's so interesting to me when we look at that experience is how closely it ties into the core ideas from the stuff we're looking at today. Like you said, it wasn't some sudden massive change. It was a result of all those consistent small efforts that eventually brought about that bigger improvement.
Yeah, exactly. And the excerpts you sent from Atomic Habits, they really dive deep into this, and they do it in a really compelling way. And one thing that I thought was particularly cool was the author's own journey as he was developing these ideas. Like he started out just sharing his own experiments with habit formation, just writing these articles for his website. He wasn't trying to come across as some sort of expert from the get-go. It was more like he was figuring things out along with everyone else. And his audience, it grew pretty quickly, actually. He went from something like 1,000 email subscribers to over 100,000 in just a couple of years.
Yeah.
And that in itself, I mean, that says a lot about what can happen when you just consistently put out good information. And it naturally led to him getting speaking engagements and then eventually writing the book. It feels like his own understanding of these ideas kind of evolved right alongside his readers, which is really neat.
I think that organic kind of growth definitely lends a lot of authenticity to the concepts, for sure. It wasn't like this top down kind of thing, but more like this collaborative exploration of what works, in a real world kind of way.
For sure. So for everyone listening, what we're hoping to do in this deep dive is really dig into those key takeaways, those actionable insights that can help us understand how seemingly small, almost insignificant habits can actually build up over time and produce these huge results. It's not about chasing after that one big win or some dramatic overnight transformation. It's about getting a grasp on the power of consistency, that incremental progress, the kind that might not be super obvious right away. And we're going to talk about some pretty interesting concepts that might help explain why we don't always see those immediate results that we might be hoping for. Things like lagging measures, for example, and this really fascinating concept called the plateau of latent potential. But first, let's dive a little deeper into this whole idea of the power of small habits. The text brings up this concept of habits being like lagging measures. What does that actually mean for us in our everyday lives?
Well, what's really interesting here is this shift in perspective and how we view our accomplishments. Like we often fixate on that immediate outcome that we want, right? But the book, it kind of encourages us to reframe our habits as these scoreboards, these ongoing tallies of our actions. Like take your current net worth, for instance. It's not just this arbitrary number. It's a reflection of your financial habits over time. It's a result of how you've been saving, spending, and investing consistently over the long haul. Same thing with your current weight, right? It's a direct reflection of your eating habits over weeks, months, years, whatever. The level of knowledge you have, that's just the accumulation of all your learning habits, those times you decided to read, study, engage with new information, all of that. Even how tidy your house is, it's a lagging measure of your cleaning habits. And the main takeaway here, as the book puts it, is super simple. You get what you repeat.
It's that idea that those small actions, the ones we do over and over again, whether they're good or bad, they don't exist in isolation. They compound on each other. And there's this powerful image the book uses. It says, if you want to get a glimpse into where you'll be in life down the road, just take a look at those tiny gains you're making, or those tiny losses for that matter, each day. And think about how those choices are going to add up over the next 10, 20 years. It gives some pretty relatable examples too, like consistently spending a little less than you earn every month, making time to hit the gym a couple times a week, or even just reading a few pages of a book each day. These seemingly small, everyday choices, what the author calls daily battles, those are the things that really shape who we become. And it's that magnification over time that's so powerful. So for everyone listening, take a second to think about those small things you do consistently. Are they moving you closer to where you want to be, or are they pulling you further away?
That's exactly it. Time really does act as this huge amplifier. Those positive habits, when you apply them consistently, they generate this almost exponential growth over time. But the flip side is that those negative habits, if you keep indulging them, they lead to a pretty significant decline. That's why those seemingly insignificant choices we make each day carry so much weight in the long run.
Now, this brings us to a concept that I think is really important, especially for anyone who's ever felt like they're putting in the effort but not really seeing the results they expect. It's the idea of the plateau of latent potential and the valley of disappointment. Could you walk us through what those mean? Because I think this is a point where a lot of people can get discouraged and end up just giving up on building new habits altogether.
This is definitely a crucial insight if you're trying to stay motivated, for sure. We tend to have this expectation that progress is going to be linear. We start a new habit, whether it's learning a new skill or committing to a new workout routine, and we naturally expect to see improvements right away. And when those visible results don't appear quickly enough, that's when we can find ourselves in what the book calls the valley of disappointment. It can feel like you're working hard but getting nowhere. But here's where it gets interesting. There's also this thing called the plateau of latent potential. Imagine it this way. You might be putting in the work day after day, making little improvements, but those results, they're kind of like being stored up. They're not visible on the surface yet. It's like the analogy the book uses. Imagine you're heating up an ice cube. You steadily raise the temperature from, say, 25 degrees to 31 degrees, but to the naked eye, it still looks like a solid block of ice. It might feel like you're wasting your time, but the reality is all that energy is being stored inside that ice. And then, boom, you hit 32 degrees and suddenly it melts. It's this seemingly overnight transformation.
That's such a good visual. So it's like what might seem like an overnight success
Yeah.
to everyone else is actually the culmination of all that work that happened behind the scenes, all that effort during those times when it felt like nothing was changing. It's like that geological pressure the book talks about,
Okay.
two tectonic plates grinding against each other for years, and then all of a sudden, bam, there's an earthquake. So for everyone listening, if you're feeling like things aren't changing, even though you're putting in the work, it doesn't necessarily mean your efforts are pointless. You might just be on that plateau, building up that latent potential, getting ready for that breakthrough moment.
Exactly. It really highlights the importance of patience and persistence, especially in those early stages when you're just getting started with a new habit.
Mhm.
You might not see that instant reward you're looking for, but that doesn't mean it's not coming. You're actively contributing to that latent potential, just waiting for that tipping point.
Okay, so we're starting to get a sense of the power of those small habits and why progress might seem so slow at first. Now, the book introduces this really interesting idea, something that almost feels counterintuitive at first, that solely focusing on the results you want isn't actually the most effective way to improve. Instead, it suggests we should shift our attention to systems. So what's the difference between focusing on goals versus focusing on systems? And why does the book advocate for systems?
This is a pretty fundamental shift in how we approach the whole idea of getting better at something. We tend to be very goal-oriented, Like we want to lose a certain amount of weight, reach a specific milestone in our careers, learn a new language to a certain level of fluency. We fixate on these outcomes. But what often gets overlooked are those daily and weekly processes, those routines we have in place that are actually driving those results. And that's where systems thinking comes in. The main idea is that if you focus on fixing and optimizing the inputs, your daily habits and routines, the outputs, those desired results, they'll kind of take care of themselves. Like the book uses this analogy. Fix the inputs and the outputs will fix
So
themselves.
instead of setting a goal like lose 20 pounds, it's about creating and sticking to a system that involves healthy eating and regular exercise. It's about the actions you're actually taking day in and day out. So for anyone listening, take a look at the systems you have in place right now. Are they moving you in the right direction?
Yeah, and the book makes a good point that when you only address problems at the level of results, you're often just putting a band-aid on a bigger issue. To actually create real lasting change, you got to get to the root of the problem. You got to address those underlying systems that are producing those results in the first place.
It also talks about how a goals first mindset can have some downsides, which I thought was really interesting, like how we can end up always putting off our happiness until we reach that next big milestone. It's
Mhm.
like, once I get this, then I'll be happy. It creates this sense that happiness is always just out of reach, something for our future selves to experience, never something we can enjoy right now.
And what's really interesting there is that this constant pushing off of happiness can actually make us less happy in the present. The journey itself becomes less enjoyable because we're so focused on the destination. And goals can sometimes create this all or nothing kind of thinking where we feel like we've failed unless we hit that specific target, which is often some pretty big, ambitious thing. Systems, on the other hand, they provide this sense of ongoing progress. It's not about hitting some arbitrary target, it's about continually improving, about being engaged in the process itself.
That makes a lot of sense. It takes the pressure off of that single end goal and puts the focus on the journey, on those consistent daily actions.
Yeah.
So we've talked about the power of small habits and why it's important to focus on systems rather than just goals. Now the book gets into something even more fundamental, the role of identity in building good habits. How does our sense of self, of who we are, actually influence the habits we create and maintain?
This is where things get really personal. This is where the motivation for changing our habits becomes something that comes from within. The book explains that our behaviors are often a direct reflection of our identity, whether we realize it or not. What we consistently do tells us a lot about who we believe we are. There's this research that shows that once someone sees themselves as a voter, they're way more likely to actually vote than someone who simply says they want to vote. The difference is that connection to their sense of self.
So if you truly see yourself as a healthy person, someone who's active and takes care of themselves, making choices that fit that identity, things like exercising or eating nutritious food, it feels less like a chore or something you have to force yourself to do. It feels more natural, like an extension of who you already are.
Exactly. When your behaviors and your core identity are aligned, you're not just trying to change what you do on the outside, you're simply acting in a way that's consistent with who you already believe yourself to be on the inside. And the book points out that this works both ways. Our habits shape our identity, and our identity influences our habits. It's this powerful feedback loop. So the focus shouldn't be just on achieving some outcome, it should be on becoming the kind of person who naturally achieves those outcomes.
That's such a powerful idea. It's about shifting the focus from what you want to have to who you want to be.
Yeah.
And the book even goes as far as to say that identity change is the key to lasting habit change.
Hmm.
And then the rest of the book lays out this really practical, step-by-step framework for actually building better habits. It calls it the 4 laws of behavior change. Let's start with the first law, make it obvious. And it all begins with this 4-step process that's at the heart of every habit: cue, craving, response, and reward.
Yeah, this is like the basic blueprint for understanding how habits work. Every habit, whether it's good, bad, or neutral, follows this neurological loop. First, there's the cue, which is like a trigger. It signals to your brain that it's time to start a particular behavior. It's basically a piece of information that predicts a potential reward. Our brains are constantly scanning for these cues, both inside and outside of us. Then comes the craving, which is what drives us to act. It's that desire to change your current state. Importantly, though, we don't actually crave the habit itself. We crave the feeling, the satisfaction that we think the habit will bring us. The response is the actual habit itself, the thing you do. It could be a physical action, a thought, or even choosing not to do something. And finally, there's a reward, which is the whole point of the habit. It satisfies your craving and teaches your brain whether this behavior is worth remembering and repeating.
And the book makes it clear that if any one of these stages is missing or weak, the habit probably won't form or it won't stick around. If there's no cue, the process doesn't even start. If the craving isn't strong enough, you're not motivated to act. If the response is too hard or takes too much effort, you're less likely to do it consistently. And if the reward isn't satisfying, your brain has no reason to encode that behavior and make it a habit. So the first law, make it obvious, it's all about the cue. It explains how these cues can become so deeply embedded in our minds through repetition and association that we don't even consciously notice them anymore.
What's interesting here is how these cues become so strongly linked in our minds to both primary rewards, things like food and water that we need to survive, and secondary rewards, which are things we learn to value through our experiences and culture, things like money, status, approval from others. Over time, the way we respond to those familiar cues, it can become so automatic that the urge to act in a certain way can feel like it's coming out of nowhere. That's why the book stresses that the very first step in changing your behavior is becoming more aware of your current habits and the things that trigger them. Like the psychologist Carl Jung said, until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate.
So to bring those unconscious habits and their triggers into the light of day, to make them more conscious, the book suggests using a tool called the Habit Scorecard. That sounds like a pretty straightforward exercise, something anyone listening could do.
It is. It's simple but effective. You just take some time to write down a list of all the habits you have in a day. Just the act of writing them down forces you to become more aware of what you're actually doing on a regular basis, the good, the bad, the in between. The book gives you a starting point. It says you could start with things like waking up, brushing your teeth, getting dressed. The key is to make those often automatic behaviors more conscious so you can start to analyze the cues that make them happen.
It's almost like that pointing and calling thing they do in the Japanese railway system where the conductors physically point at important signals and say what they're seeing and doing out loud to make sure everything's safe and accurate. It's this deliberate action that raises awareness and reduces the chance of errors.
It's the same idea. By saying what you're doing out loud, you bring it from the unconscious realm into the conscious realm. And once you have a better understanding of your existing habits and those cues that trigger them, you can start to be more intentional about how you respond to them. The book then introduces a couple of strategies that are really good at making the cues for desirable habits more obvious. These are called implementation intentions and habit stacking.
Okay, let's break those down for everyone. Implementation intentions are all about being super specific about the who, what, when, where, and how of the new habit you want to create. It follows a simple formula. I will enforce specific behavior at specific time in specific location.
What makes that strategy so effective is that it gets rid of all the vagueness. There's no guessing about when or where the habit should happen. Instead of just saying, I want to exercise more, you create a concrete plan, like, I will go for a 30-minute walk at 6 p.m. in the park near my house. That pre-commitment creates a much stronger mental trigger for the behavior.
And then there's habit stacking, which is this neat technique that basically piggybacks on your existing habits to help you build new ones. The formula for that one is, after current habit, I will new habit.
That's a really good way to add new habits to your routine because it uses those neural pathways that are already established, making the new behavior feel more natural and less like something extra you got to do. You're using something you already do automatically as a cue for the new thing you want to start doing. Like after I brush my teeth in the morning, I will meditate for 1 minute. So the habit of brushing your teeth becomes the trigger for the new habit of meditation. The book even suggests making a list of all your daily habits so you can find potential anchor habits to use for habit stacking.
It's all about making those cues for the good habits super obvious in your environment. And that brings us to the idea that the environment itself has a huge impact on our behavior, even if we don't realize it. The book even mentions Lewin's equation, which states that behavior is a function of the person and their environment. So everyone listening, think about how your current environment might be shaping your habits, both the good ones and the bad ones.
That equation shows just how much our surroundings influence our choices, often without us even realizing it. We tend to go with the option that's easiest and most readily available. The book uses examples like how Bud Light is everywhere in bars, or how there's a Starbucks on practically every corner. It's not that people necessarily love those options the most, it's that they're so easy to choose because they're everywhere.
And because our brains are so visually oriented, making the best choice, the most visually obvious choice, is really important. It's about being strategic with those cues. If you want to drink more water, keep a full water bottle where you can see it. If you want to read more, leave a book out on your coffee table. So for you, what's one good habit you'd like to build, and how can you make the cue for that habit more obvious in your environment, like right now?
Good question. And the opposite is true too. You can redesign your environment to make bad habits less obvious and therefore harder to do. If you're trying to cut back on junk food, don't keep it in your house. It's much harder to eat it if it's not there. The book even suggests creating separate spaces for different activities in your home, what it calls the one space, one use principle. Like having a dedicated office space can help you separate work life from home life. It also makes the point that it's often easier to build new habits in a new environment because you're not fighting against those old cues that are already there.
Okay, so that covers the first law, make it obvious. The second law is make it attractive. That makes sense, right? We're drawn to things that are appealing, that we think will bring us pleasure. And as we talked about earlier, the book says that craving is the driving force behind every habit.
And what's really insightful is that we don't actually crave the habit itself. We crave the feeling we associate with that habit. And the release of certain chemicals in our brain, like dopamine, plays a big role in those cravings. The book also points out that bad habits can be self-perpetuating. They feed the negative feelings that keep us doing them. It's a tough cycle to break. And once those pathways in our brains that are associated with the habit get really strong from repetition, they're really hard to completely erase. That's why just relying on willpower to resist temptation isn't usually a very effective long-term strategy.
So if willpower isn't the answer, what is? How do we make those good habits more attractive?
Well, the book talks about the importance of social influence. As humans, we have this deep need to belong, to connect with others, to be accepted. Behaviors become more attractive when they make us feel like we fit in. We tend to imitate the habits of people we're close to, the larger group around us, and people we see as successful or powerful. Pick tells the story about Turkish smokers that illustrates this perfectly.
Oh yeah, the one about how people often start smoking because their friends do it, even if they don't enjoy it at first. It really shows how powerful social norms can be. And then there's also the idea of reframing those cravings we have that are associated with bad habits. It's about finding and emphasizing the positive aspects of those good habits we want to build.
That's a really helpful way to think about it. For example, instead of thinking about those presentation jitters as nerves, you can think of them as excitement. It's the same physical feeling, but you're interpreting it differently. Or you can actively focus on the positive feelings and benefits that come from good habits. Like with mindfulness meditation, instead of getting frustrated by distracting thoughts, you can see them as opportunities to practice bringing your attention back to your breath.
Okay, so we've got make it obvious and make it attractive. The third law is make it easy. That one's pretty self-explanatory. If something feels too hard or complicated, we're not going to do it very often. And the book makes a distinction between being in motion and taking action. Can you explain that?
Yeah, this is a really important point. It's easy to get caught up in being in motion, which means doing things like planning, researching, organizing things that feel like you're making progress, but don't actually produce any results. It's a form of procrastination, a way to avoid the risk of actually doing the thing. Real habit formation comes from actually performing the behavior, from taking action. And the key thing to remember is that habits are formed based on how often you do them, not how long you spend doing them. Repetition is what strengthens those neural connections. There's this cool example the book gives about London taxi drivers who have a larger hippocampus, the part of the brain responsible for spatial memory, because of all the training they do. It shows how the brain actually changes and adapts with repeated use.
So to make good habits easier, we need to reduce the friction, make them as easy to do as possible. The book talks about the law of least effort, which basically says that we're always going to choose the option that requires the least amount of effort.
It's like that analogy with the garden hose. If there's a kink in the hose, it reduces the flow of water. By straightening out the hose, by removing those points of friction, we make it easier for the water to flow. The book compares this to the idea of lean production in manufacturing, where the goal is to eliminate waste and streamline processes to be as efficient as possible. And you see this in successful companies, too. They try to make their products and services as easy to use as possible, things like meal delivery apps or dating
It's
apps.
not just about minimizing the external friction, though. It's also about setting up your environment to make the desired action the default option.
Right.
This idea of resetting the room, as described by Oswald Knuckles, sounds like a good way to do that.
Absolutely. It's about preparing your surroundings so that doing the right thing is the easiest thing to do. Like when you finish watching TV, take a few seconds to put the remote back, fluff the pillows, fold the blanket. It's not just about being tidy. It's about setting yourself up for success next time you walk into that room. The book also talks about decisive moments, those little choices we make throughout the day that end up shaping our future choices. And then there's the 2-minute rule.
Yeah, the 2-minute rule. This is such a useful technique for getting over that initial hurdle of starting a new habit. The idea is that when you're first establishing a new habit, it should take less than 2 minutes to do. So instead of read before bed, it becomes read one page. Instead of run 3 miles every morning, it becomes just put on my running shoes.
The brilliance of the 2-minute rule is that it makes getting started so easy. Pretty much anyone can do something for 2 minutes. And once you've started, even in a small way, it's much easier to keep going. Those 2-minute actions become gateway habits that lead to bigger things. The book also says to standardize before you optimize. In other words, you can't improve a habit that doesn't exist yet. Focus on establishing the routine before you worry about making it perfect.
Okay, we've made it obvious, attractive, and easy. Now for the fourth and final law. Make it satisfying. We're much more likely to repeat a behavior if it's enjoyable or rewarding. And the book emphasizes that immediate rewards are the most effective because our brains are wired to prioritize the present moment.
This is one of the biggest challenges we face when it comes to building good habits. A lot of the habits that are the most beneficial in the long run, things like exercise, saving money, learning new skills, they don't offer immediate gratification. Our brains, which evolved in a time when actions had more immediate consequences, they're still programmed to seek pleasure and avoid pain in the moment. That's why we need to find ways to make good habits feel rewarding right away and to make bad habits feel unsatisfying right away.
So how do we do that? How do we bridge that gap between the immediate action of a good habit and its long-term benefits?
One way is to use reinforcement. That means intentionally adding a little bit of immediate pleasure or satisfaction to those good habits that pay off in the long run. The book gives the example of a couple who had put money into a trip to Europe fund every time they skipped eating out. It's about rewarding yourself for making the right choice.
And it works the other way, too. You can make bad habits less satisfying by making them immediately uncomfortable or unpleasant, like setting up financial penalties for yourself if you don't stick to your goals, or finding an accountability partner who will hold you to your commitments. The book has a funny story about a guy who had to wear an embarrassing Alabama hat if he didn't do his sprints.
It's about making those consequences real and immediate. And then there's habit tracking, which can make habits more satisfying by giving you visual proof of your progress. It taps into that desire we all have to keep a streak going.
Habit tracking gives you this tangible evidence of your efforts. It shows you how far you've come. Plus, if you see a blank space on your tracker, it can be a strong motivator to keep going and not break your streak. It becomes a reward in itself. So those are the 4 laws of behavior change. The book also touches on some more advanced strategies for optimizing your habits, like finding ways to align your habits with your natural strengths and talents. And it talks about the Goldilocks rule, which means finding that sweet spot where a task is challenging enough to keep you engaged but not so challenging that you get discouraged and give up. And then there's the idea of flow state, which is that feeling of being completely absorbed in what you're doing.
Yeah, the Goldilocks rule is all about finding that perfect balance between boredom and overwhelm. And to really stick with your habits over time, you got to embrace boredom. Even the most successful people feel unmotivated sometimes. The difference is that they still show up and do the work. They stick to their schedule. And to reach a really high level of skill in anything, the book says you need to practice deliberately and reflect on your progress. It's about going beyond just doing things automatically.
And it all comes back to what the book calls the cardinal rule of behavior change. What is immediately rewarded is repeated, and what is immediately punished is avoided. So as we wrap up this deep dive, what are some of the key takeaways you'd like our listeners to remember and put into practice?
A few things come to mind. First, that 2-minute rule. It's so simple, but it's so effective for getting started with new habits. Second, that shift from focusing on goals to focusing on systems. It's about the daily actions and routines that lead to the results you want. And third, the importance of understanding your own identity and making sure your habits are aligned with the kind of person you want to be. That's where real, lasting change comes from.
I agree. And for everyone listening, think about one small habit you can implement today. Based on what we've talked about, maybe you can create a habit scorecard to become more aware of your current behaviors, or try applying the 2-minute rule to that thing you've been meaning to start but haven't yet.
And one last thought. How might shifting your focus from achieving outcomes to embodying a specific identity change the way you approach not just your goals, but your whole life? What kind of person do you want to be?
That's a great question to think about.
Yeah.
And we encourage you to go back and read those excerpts from Atomic Habits again with these new ideas in mind. See what else jumps out at you. Think about how these principles of behavior change could apply to other areas of your life. Until next time, keep exploring, keep learning, and keep digging deep.